Hello. So today the Center of Economic Strategy invites you to join the presentation of the study devoted to constructive capital in Ukraine and the following discussion. My name is Yana Frimenko and I will moderate the event today. And the research we discuss today is continuation of the studies we previously conducted regarding the opposite of constructive capital, which means corrosive capital, which includes oligarchic, Russian, and Chinese capital in Ukraine. Please leave your questions during the event in questions and answers section in Zoom. The presentation is also available on CES website, and you can also find it in the Zoom chat. Media partner, the research and presentation are being conducted with the support of the Center for International Private Enterprise, CIPE, and media partner of the event is the Kyiv Independent. So to start with, we would like to invite Brian Lee, Program Director for Eastern Europe at CIPE, to take the floor for welcoming remarks.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you all for being here this evening. As she said, my name is Brian Lee. I'm the Program Director for Ukraine and Eastern Europe at the Center for International Private Enterprise, or CIPE. CIPE is proud to be a partner of the Center for Economic Strategy, and we've, over the years, we've supported its work looking into the investment landscape in Ukraine. And as you all are aware, Ukraine's economy has been characterized by several things that have, to an extent, stunted its growth as a market-oriented economy. This includes large concentration of wealth by certain individuals or oligarchs, to an extent oversized Russian investment in certain key sectors, and also the lack of a regulatory framework that encourages more active engagement in the formal economy. The most recent CES report undertaken with CIPE support is the latest in a series that looks at different types of capital in a country's economic system and how they impact the market and subsequent business development. There are two main types of capital investment, as was mentioned: corrosive capital and constructive capital and corrosive capital. And whereas constructive capital plays a key role in driving the development of a competitive market, corrosive capital has the opposite effect, undermining market development and opportunity as an individual or entity uses such capital to position themselves for one reason or another at the expense of others. The current report assesses how local capital currently operates in Ukraine and how it can be developed further, with a special emphasis on small and medium-sized enterprises. Again, thank you all for joining this evening, and I hope you find the presentation and subsequent discussion both insightful and useful.
Okay, thank you so much, Brian. So for now, I'd like to invite my colleagues, Volodymyr Landa, Senior Economist at CES, and Alexandra Maronenko, Junior Economist at CES, who were the principal investigators of the research we are discussing today. So could you please start presenting?
Thank you, Yana. Thank you, Brian, for welcome words. I hope everyone can see the screen. So we could begin. My name is Volodymyr Landa. I'm glad to present our presentation about constructive capital in Ukraine. That's the presentation version. The whole report will be available later this week on CES website. And what will we do in the next 12 minutes is, first of all, we'll talk about types of capital which we define in, so sorry for these slides. Now we are good. That's our contents. First of all, we are defining types of capital. Then we'll say a few words about previous research of corrosive capital, and then we'll have an estimation about amount of constructive and corrosive capital in Ukrainian economy, and then we'll have a discussion about what to do later, how to make constructive capital grow in Ukrainian economy. So for the first slides, I would like to give the floor to my colleague Alexandra Mironenko about key types of capital and their features. Please, Alexandra.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I would like to start with a more theoretical part of the research presentation and tell what constructive and corrosive capital is. So the Center for International Private Enterprise distinguish between these two types of capital, as you can see of these terms on the slide. And so corrosive capital refers to opaque capital flows lacking market orientation with motives to exploit governance gaps to influence economic, political, and social developments. And in contrast, constructive capital represents well-governed investment flows that serve transparent, market-oriented, and accountable purposes at the both funding sources and destinations. And the key objective of efforts to maintain constructive capital is the need to reduce corrosive capital, which is the opposite of constructive capital. And the next slide, please. So we can see here the next slide. I don't see it. Volodymyr, the next slide, please.
We have a time gap, a few seconds.
Okay, so yes, so we distinguished the next features of constructive and corrosive capital, and let's start with corrosive, and I still don't see it. Okay, so first feature of corrosive capital is opaque origin. This indicates that the original source of this capital is not clear and unknown. Also, the important feature of corrosive capital is asset mismanagement, and this indicates that corrosive capital may be invested in inefficient projects or asset may be mismanaged. Also, it is important exerting political influence. This indicates that corrosive capital can be used to exert political pressure or influence government decisions. And of course, for Ukraine, it's very important corruption flows that indicate that constructive capital may be linked to corruption and other schemes. Yes, and for the features of constructive capital, we divided them into two main groups, features that are related to the economic environment and the companies. So economic environment, here we have a rule of law. So the constructive capital provides for the rule of law, which is important for investors, namely integrity, stability, and transparency in decision-making and risk analysis and so on. Also, it is important for constructive capital integrity and accountable institutions, also encouraging fair competition and economic inclusion. So it means involvement of the wider population, ensuring equal access to economic opportunities, and of course, the equal rights for all. And the last feature here is development of human capital. Its development increases labor productivity and efficiency, which are the main components and basis of innovation and technological progress, and the basis of constructive capital also. And here is also very important to mention development of civil society, that increase in education and awareness of the population fosters active participation in civil society, which contributes to the development of constructive capital by creating social background for development of constructive capital. And for the companies, for constructive capital, it's very important transparent financial flows. The constructive capital involves transparent, regulated, and accountable financial transactions that promote trust and stability in the investment landscape. The next feature is corporate responsibility and sustainable development. Here, essential are support for multilateral principles and collective industry initiatives as, for example, the UN Sustainable Development Goals and ECG principles, environmental, social, and government. Also, high standards of management and no corrosive footprint are also very important for companies in the development of constructive capital. And given that we are just beginning to explore these concepts of constructive and corrosive capital, it is important to mention that these features are not absolutely categorical. Just because a company has one of these features, it does not necessarily mean that this company belongs to one or another types of capital. Yes.
Thank you, Alexandra. So as we can see, there are different features, and the company may have the features of both corrosive and constructive capital, which makes in some cases harder to understand which capital company's capital belongs to. I still have some problems with the changing slides, so the time gap is like 15 seconds, so maybe we'll see it a bit later. Let me reshare the presentation, maybe it will help.
Volodya, I believe you could just pick the slide, and even if it will be not on full screen, it will be okay.
Okay, the last attempt, and then we'll go in the way we can afford. So last attempt is the following. No, not the full screen. Okay, is it convenient in that way?
You could just close this right column with properties
Okay.
and so on.
Good. Like that, right? Thanks. So we distinguish capital can be divided on different types, not only by constructive or corrosive, but also as foreign and domestic capital and private or public capital. So for the goal of this report, we first distinguish foreign and domestic capital. Foreign capital is not the subject of our detailed investigation, so we just mentioned that foreign capital also could be corrosive and constructive. Not conducting a deep dive into this topic, we mentioned that capital from corrosive jurisdictions is corrosive by definition, and also we define as corrosive capital which National Agency for Corruption Prevention mentioned as global war sponsors. Talking about domestic capital, we distinguish public and private domestic capital. Public not in the meaning that the capital is traded on stock exchanges, but in this meaning, this is government or municipal capital. And the main part of our report is private domestic capital, in which we distinguish constructive capital, oligarch capital, other types of corrosive capital other than oligarch. And as we mentioned earlier, there is a bunch of companies with private domestic capital to be distinguished later, while finalizing in detailed methodology, which could draw a big red line between corrosive and constructive capital. Talking about our previous research, our previous research of this topic were about corrosive capital. Two of them are published before full-scale invasion about Russian and Chinese economic footprint, and one of them is published about a year ago about oligarchic Ukrainian capital. But we are market-oriented research center, so we would like to focus more on not restrictions, but for opportunities for constructive capital. That's why we are going tonight with this research. So now we had tasked to understand how what is the share of constructive capital in Ukraine's economy. That is not a trivial task. We don't know about such investigations in different in other countries, including developed and developing markets. So we would like to say a few words about our approach. We have Ukrainian legislation, which divides companies to small, micro, medium, and large enterprises. Small enterprises are considered those by Ukrainian law with under 10 million euro in revenue and under 50 employees in the payroll. And there is a subset of small enterprises called micro enterprises, in which revenue doesn't exceed 2 million euro, and there are not more than 10 employees. So large enterprises, that means that an annual revenue exceeds 50 million euro, and there is more than 250 employees. All other enterprises considered as medium. So by this law, we can have a medium enterprise with unlimited revenue, given there is under 250 employees. That's Ukrainian classification, and given this classification, we can see their financials recently published in October 2023, financials for the previous year. Now we have in Ukraine about 1.7 million business entities, of which about 1.5 million are individual entrepreneurs. That's about 85% of all business entities. And there are more than 260,000 legal entities. Most of them are micro entities, more than 206,000, about 40,000 other small companies, about 15,000 medium companies, and only 494 large companies. However, medium and large companies, they have less than 1% in total quantity. However, they have about 80% of total revenue. That gives us a hypothesis that analyzing the largest enterprises, we can have a good picture about what is happening in Ukrainian economy as a whole. If you take a look at this company financials, we'll see that the top 300 companies have 41% of total national revenue. If you talk about companies, but if we add banks, it is harder to weight banks in this assessment because they do not have revenue. So we have to assess the bank capital by assets. In this case, we'll have this picture that top 300 companies have 27% adjusted share in assets, and smaller companies which I would remind are almost 1.5 million, including individual entrepreneurs, have 58%, while banks have 15% share in assets. So total assets in the Ukrainian economy, according to their financial, is $500 billion in 2022. So how we see the types of capital? We analyzed all companies among top 300, and we see oligarch and government capital dominance, which in total gives us a half of all capital in top 300 enterprises. So constructive capital accounts here only for 12%. However, there is a part of capital to be determined. What does it mean, capital to be determined? Is two possible ways for company to get into this column. The first one is combining features of both corrosive and constructive capital, and the second is a lack of information about this company. When we talk about largest companies, as a rule, that is combining corrosive and constructive factors. And if we talk about smaller companies, that's a larger part, which is not so clear to analyze. So if we talk about the second line, other companies, the share of foreign capital is almost the same. However, government capital in this group significantly decreases. And in the segment of corrosive capital, oligarch give the lead to other corrosive capital. For example, for capital which is connected to local authorities in a not appropriate way. And there is a slight growth in the constructive capital. And for sure, we have a growth in the segment to be determined. Banks are the most transparent segment because banks have very transparent ownership structure, and banks have other and National Bank of Ukraine gives all statistics about ownership and assets and liabilities of Ukrainian banks. And in this segment, 53% is government capital. Government owns 5 out of 63 currently operating banks. The second group is foreign capital, amounting to 28% in total, and only 4% can be named as constructive capital, at the lesser value than in any other group. So when we sum these numbers according to our weights, we'll see that at least 15% can be named as constructive, and at least 31%, 18 plus 13, as corrosive capital. However, there is 20% to be determined, and if we will make another hypothesis to how they are distributed between other categories, given the numbers of companies we have analyzed earlier, we'll have this picture as we see in the last row. So about 22% can be named as constructive capital, about 21% as oligarch capital, 20% as other corrosive capital. The first place is government capital, 17%. I should make a note that 22%, it doesn't mean that this share is exactly 22% because of some hypotheses I mentioned earlier, because of some questions about where to make a line between corrosive and constructive capital. This number can vary, but not in very big variations. So we can say that with high probability, the share of constructive capital in Ukrainian economy is between 20 and 25%. And our best estimation as for 2023 is the share of 22%. How to visualize this? If we'll do this visualization, we can see that constructive domestic private capital is the biggest bubble with 22%. However, I would prefer another interpretation. When we combine all corrosive units, then we'll have that corrosive capital amounts to almost a half of Ukrainian economy, while constructive private capital includes foreign one, amounts to only a third of Ukraine's economy, and about 1/5 is public domestic capital, mainly owned by Ukrainian government. Yesterday we had a meeting with Ukrainian economists, and they had a point that often public domestic capital in Ukraine is also pretty much corrosive, but for the moment we do not make such an estimation. We consider public domestic capital as a single bubble. So when we see this picture, which are our next steps? Then we went to our stakeholders. We had stakeholders of different times. Most of them were CEOs or founders of businesses, which we believe represent constructive capital. Some of them was representatives of business associations, and we had some interviews with the policy makers, including in Ministry of Economy and with members of Ukrainian Parliament. And let me show you the findings I would like to share with you. The main point I would like to say that the difference between constructive and corrosive capital is morality. There is a citation I like very much because regardless what are the laws, if there is no civil social contract to make capital more constructive, we will have no result. We should aim as a society to increase the share of constructive capital in Ukrainian economy. There were two points mentioned by almost every people we talked to. These two key recommendations include uniform rules for all and clear and predictable anti-deregulation. Uniform rules means clear and predictable rules of the game without selective justice and without undue influence from the state. And the second point is deregulation, to give business more opportunities without any unnecessary regulations, and this will stimulate business to develop, to increase investments, and to create new jobs. And the next slide is some other recommendations we heard more than once from Ukrainian business. These recommendations could be grouped in several blocks. First of all, rule of law. Protection of property rights is crucial for constructive capital development. The judicial reform and anti-corruption reform are also in this block. And the second block is compact states. Compact states, which includes comprehensive privatization, customs reform, and tariff liberalization. For example, one main thing I would like to mention in this block is the important thing in comprehensive privatization is when we make smaller our bubble of public or governmental capital. We have to ensure that we are growing the constructive capital block, not the corrosive capital block. The next block is tax changes. Our interviewees told us about a predictable tax policy and implementation of the tax of repatriated capital instead of income tax. I would like to mention here that almost no one said about just lower taxes. That is not a decision, and that makes us believe that we interviewed companies which are really constructive capital. Other steps proposed by business are EU and NATO integration and adjustment of the education system to the labor market requirements. This recommendation of the education system means that is mentioned by different businesses, including IT business, which grow its future workers in separate academies, not in the traditional education system. And for just machine building manufacturers, which have an absolutely different type of workers, so they also see the deficits of in the labor market. And what we want to add here is the war risk insurance, because war risk is the factor which is against investment in Ukraine. So when government makes any circumstance to help private companies or foreign governments to manage risk insurance, so it will stimulate private and governmental investors to make new investments in the Ukrainian economy, which remain risky when the war is not over. So that's our key developments of this report. The full version will be available a bit later on our website. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Volodymyr. So to start with, we already have a question from one of today's panelists. So Pavlo Sheremeta, distinguished fellow at GlobSec and former Minister of Economy and Trade, would like to know how we came up with 5% of corrosive foreign capital.
Let me have back the presentations. Let's see it. 5% of foreign corrosive capital. It includes capital which is linked to corrosive economies like Russian, Chinese, and so on. The second part is companies included by National Agency for Corruption Prevention in the Global War Sponsors list. This list is subject of change. We have some changes on a weekly basis in this list, so this number can be changed, but not in a very big diapason. So 5% is current estimation as for now.
Thank you, Volodymyr. And one more question from the participants. So in Ukraine, sole proprietors are definitely prevalent. So on one hand, you cannot classify this as corrosive capital because it's not oligarchic, not Chinese, not Russian. But on the other hand, it kind of facilitates tax evasion and might potentially break the rule of law. So how would you comment on this?
Sorry, I didn't get it. What companies we're talking about?
About sole proprietors, or as participant mentioned, FOPs.
I mean, if I correctly interpret these questions, it means of illegal use of FOPs in their activity. So if the person is just an individual entrepreneur, that's not a violation. And if one company is using fictive folks, it's definitely a violation. So we should see not only if there is a FOB, that's not a violation by itself, but when the usual company's activities are nominally performed by FOBs, that is a sign of violation, and that is sign of corrosive capital undoubtedly.
Okay, thank you for such a detailed answer. So we have a couple of questions just to initiate the discussion. So today, Thomas Fiala is among our panelists, who is the European Business Association board member and CEO of Dragon Capital. Hello, thank you for coming. So the question is, how do you think, what are the key benefits arising from promoting constructive capital? So how can society as a whole, in particular Ukrainian society, benefit from facilitating constructive capital development?
Well, it's quite clear that without capital there is no development of no economic development, and when there is no economic development, in case of Ukraine, the country is weak to defend itself against our aggressive neighbor. So it's vital to Ukraine's survival to be economically strong and be able to support itself. In terms of capital, how we measure capital investments, there are two ways to measure it. One is internal fixed asset investment creation, which in the case of the countries to Ukraine's western border has been at about the level of 25% of GDP over the last 30 years. In case of Ukraine, it's been unfortunately rarely above 20% in the last years, even before the war. Since 2014, it's been actually under 20%. The same is the case for foreign direct investments, which have accumulated to a little bit over $50 billion versus Poland's over $200 billion between 1991 and 2015, roughly. So that has led to low GDP growth, much lower GDP per capita than neighboring countries, and that is leading also to lower social development of people, starting with migration, with life expectancy, which in Central European countries has over 20 years from 1990 till 2010 grown by roughly 7 years. In Ukraine, it's been stable over that period of time. So there are a lot of negative implications from small investments, from lower investments. As I said, we measure it as a percentage of GDP, whether it's FDI or internal investments. They should be much higher. The reasons why they have been lower in Ukraine is, first of all, less rule of law than in the neighboring countries, and the lack of deregulation. Tariffs haven't been liberalized to this date. Privatization hasn't been completed. Such things have been done in Central Europe in the 90s. Otherwise, these countries would not have joined the EU in 2004. So Ukraine still has a lot of homework to do, which has been prevented from completion by populistic politicians and by the influence of oligarchs over media and politics.
Okay, thank you so much. We also have a question for Pavlo Sheremeta. So could you please share with us, from your perspective, what are, let's say, top 3, top 5 obstacles to development of constructive capital in Ukraine?
Well, thank you. First of all, I'm not in Kiev, I'm in Kolomyia, which is not even a regional center, it's a district city. It's a large but district city, and I'm in a restaurant here. So the internet connection might be unstable, and I'm sorry about that. I'm working here with the city council and the city mayor, actually on promotion of entrepreneurship and investment and capital. So let me first of all reflect on some of the findings, and then I will try to respond to your question. A few things. Well, first of all, I'm glad that we cleared up this issue of politically exposed people, so they are not longer considered to be by default corrosive, and their capital is not considered to be corrosive. So, Volodymyr, thank you for that. Now, similarly, guys, look, we should be careful calling all the Chinese capital as corrosive. You know, I mean, like, look, first of all, there is a lot of capital there. Second of all, there are a lot of private companies there. Maybe we should distinguish Chinese state-owned companies and private companies, but calling by default all of the Chinese capital by corrosive, I think it may be a little bit detrimental. And similarly, by the way, let me reflect on the story, actually notorious and ridiculous story that I faced with when I was a minister in 2014. One of the Chamber of Commerce's, I will later I will later say the origin of that Chamber of Commerce, was forcing me to fight with Australian Parliament, forcing me as the trade minister to fight through WTO with the Australian Parliament against their law on tobacco packaging law, which obviously the global tobacco industry did not like in 2014. So Ukraine, Honduras and Indonesia lobbied WTO to fight against that law in Australia, basically, you know, making us enemies with Australian democracy, I would say. Now, the Chamber of Commerce was American, okay? American, okay? Obviously, you know, now Ukraine has simple, what's the name of that? Simple tobacco packaging law, basically that you cannot promote the logos. So obviously we were, as a government, we were on the right side of the history, and American Chamber of Commerce was not. And that was reflected. I mean, you can Google one of the New York Times articles that was actually criticizing heavily the American Chamber of Commerce in 2014 in Ukraine too, and not only in Ukraine, you know, for making corrosive actions, corrupt corrosive actions. So basically, you know, just classifying the countries. Obviously, you know, the majority of the capital in the US is probably constructive, and we have to be careful with the state-owned companies in China. I'm not mentioning Russia. I mean, whenever it's private or public, obviously it's an aggressor's nation. But you know, there is a fine line there, and we have to be careful. You know, like by the way, one more example like that. I was working with DTech Academy quite intensively, and they were investing a lot in human capital development. Is that a corrosive capital? I mean, investing in thousands of people, workers, managers, in their training, in their managerial capacity, in their managerial knowledge, basically in their productivity. Are we sure that this is like that? We want to categorize that as completely corrosive action? I'm not so sure, you know, and you know. Take a small entrepreneur somewhere, maybe here in Kolomyia, basically monopolizing, finding the way through the city council, maybe not in Kolomyia here, because they will kick me out of here, but in some other Ukrainian city, working through the city council and monopolizing an access to, let's say the beach, you know. And I know the examples. I know what I'm talking about. Are we sure this is a constructive capital? So you know, the point is that these categories are ill-defined, and there will always be ill-defined. But now I'm coming back to your question, and in addition to the obstacles that were already mentioned, I'll just would like to mention one more obstacle, and by the way, which is under-researched, and I would like to encourage everybody, and especially the Center for Economic Strategy, to pay more attention to the issue of savings, because we are spending so much time on investment. Tomasz has just mentioned. I agree with him completely that this nation is underinvested. But one of the reasons why this nation is underinvested is not only foreign direct investment, the lack of foreign direct investment, and it's not only the overregulation and corruption and oligarchs, which is all true. You know, I agree with that, but it's also the issue that this nation is undersaved. You know, the savings in these nations are as low as investment. You know, we are complaining that investment is below 20%. Actually, it's 13% to be precise. But the problem is that savings is also 13%, while the savings in China is 45%. The investment in China is 42%. You know, we don't need the savings and investment as high as that, for obvious reasons, but at least 25 to 30% of savings and investment would be good. And I mean, what are the ways, and I'm finishing my short intervention, what are the ways to push the savings in Ukraine is pension reform. You know, Ukrainians are not saving for their retirement, unlike Chinese, unlike Americans, unlike Europeans. This is a big problem. Ukrainians are not saving for education as much as, I mean, any developed nation in the world. Ukrainians are not saving as much for healthcare because the nation has this notion that all of this is free. All of this is provided by the state. You know, the state should provide me with retirement. The state should provide me with education. The state should provide me with the healthcare. Why should I save for that? Which is just a complete unmodern stupidity, you know? So we need to deal with that. We need to, find a way for the Ukrainians to save more. And obviously, if you simple, as we call it in Ukrainian, malenki Ukrainians, little Ukrainians will, I mean, the lay people that are actually walking here on the street in Kolomea will start saving for their retirement, for their lifelong education, at least for the education of their kids. For the college education, they will start saving for the health insurance. That will be a constructive capital because, they are not oligarchs, working. I don't think they're all corrupt, that's quite for sure. So I believe that will increase dramatically because we need to triple the savings in Ukraine, triple, not even double. We need to triple the savings in Ukraine. And hopefully this will triple the investment rate in Ukraine because the world will see if Ukrainians will start saving and investing, the world will invest in Ukraine, of course, more of constructive capital too. Thank you very much.
Okay, actually, that's us. We'd like to thank you for such a detailed answer. Like, that was a lot. Thank you so much. And I think Volodymyr has a question for you. Volodymyr, we cannot hear you, unfortunately.
I have some answers because there was a lot of good questions by Pavlo. Thank you for that. The first one was about Chinese capital. Starting from our report, which was published a few years ago, there is a dramatic change in some jurisdictions, some countries of origins. Now, Chinese capital doesn't account to even 1% of Ukraine's economy, so the main part of this 5% of foreign corrosive capital is not the Chinese capital. And in banking system, that's less than 0.1%, just one small bank owned by Chinese capital. And that's a good idea that we should distinguish between state Chinese capital and private Chinese capital. There also can be a good point to make a further straight division between corrosive and constructive capital, more precise division. The second point is about companies which are defined as corrosive, but which do some good things for years, not by just one happening. That's a good point. That is a point I also missed in the previous research, that we for every company we should give a track to become a constructive capital, whatever they do, because every capital is corrosive in one or another historical view. If not in the last 10 years, then in the last 200 years, more or less corrosive. So we as a society or as economy, as a country, we should give a track how to become a constructive capital, what we want to do from this capital. And the second and the last point about the pension reform and savings, that's also a good point. On yesterday's discussion with Ukrainian economists, we have also discussion about capital infrastructure for constructive capital formation, but they saw it from the different angle, not only from pension system, but from stock market. But unfortunately, we don't have quick answers how to make a strong stock market in Ukraine in the perspective of several years.
Thank you. Pavel, would you like to add something?
Yes, it just came back. Well, Volodymyr, thank you very much for your clarifications, and thank you for your reflections, and actually for adjusting some of the ideas and thinking. It came back to my memory, you know, this law that I was mentioning, plain packaging tobacco law. So in 2014, Australia obviously was one of the first nations that adopted this plain packaging tobacco legislation that required all the companies to have this plain packaging. And the global tobacco industry was fighting it. Unfortunately, it was fighting by corrupt Ukrainian previous government. And as I mentioned, you know, they were still forcing me, you know, to fight it. We refused, and of course, the next government withdrew Ukraine for this horrible, notorious, scandalous deal. And later on, Ukraine actually, as many other nations, adopted plain packaging tobacco law. So now we have plain packaging of tobacco products in our stores as well. So that was my point. Plain packaging. That's the name. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So we have some more questions for our guests, but before we do ask them, Volodymyr, we have one question from a participant. So you're gonna like it for sure. In general, the question is, according to your estimations, I'm not sure whether this is correct. Please feel free to correct if it's not. That in Ukraine, there is approximately 15% of constructive capital out of total capital, which seems quite low. So in general, the question is it as low as it seems? Can you provide any comparison line? And did you expect it to be on this level before you started the research?
I am glad to have such a good speakers and audience, which helped me to give information on this point. I had to, but just had a certain time limit, so I didn't. A very good question. So about 15% or 22%, we are sure that constructive capital is more than 15%, and our current estimations give us the figure of 22% estimation of constructive capital. And given that we had certain hypotheses to reach this figure, we can strongly tell that our diapason is between 20 and 25% of corrosive capital. It's we are believing in, and is it enough or not enough? It's a very good question. We would like to compare it to other countries, but unfortunately, we are the first country to provide this estimation. Unfortunately, we cannot have figures from other countries, and even if we will, there is very hard to be sure that the line between corrosive and constructive capital in different jurisdictions is coming just in the same place. So using our intuition, we can say two things. That's a bit higher number than we were expecting, and that much lower number than the number we wanted to see. We do not want to see any corrosive capital, and now we see that this group amount of 46% of all our capital. So the goal number one, to make internal private constructive capital the largest green bubble on our presentation. We know that we cannot absolutely 100% exclude any corrosive capital. That's a very hard task, but to minimize it, it's a very reasonable task we can reach. Or maybe there was another question I forgot. Or that's all.
Yeah, this was the question, and I think you answered in a pretty detailed manner. So thank you so much. Okay, we have more questions for our guests. So Thomas, if you do not mind, you told us a lot about importance of capital. So if I'm allowed, I'd like to go back to this. So if it's so important, do you feel like it might make sense to sacrifice this objective of keeping constructive capital and just concentrate on having more capital regardless of its character or origin? Like, would you agree with this or rather disagree?
Mm-hmm. Well, we had in Czech Republic in the 90s Prime Minister and Minister of Finance Václav Klaus, who said that he doesn't differentiate between money, but I would not agree with that completely. I mean, once if the government creates proper conditions, then all capital, as in particular constructive capital, will increase its share. I mean, it will increase, all capital inflows will increase in absolute numbers, and the share of constructive capital will increase if you have rule of law and the other attributes that Volodymyr has mentioned in his presentation, which is important. And in order to limit the oligarchic or not constructive corrosive capital, you have to have properly working institutions, in particular the Anti-Monopoly Committee, that shall reduce the rent-seeking oligarchic capital. You have to have fair courts and law enforcement agencies. You shall deregulate so that the influence of the state that could be influenced by corrupt politicians is decreased. You have to liberalize tariffs so that you have market conditions in as many sectors of the economy as possible. You have to increase the share of the private market, so you also have to privatize as many assets as possible. Those are kind of the key to increase the share of constructive capital in the economy. It will flow by itself. You don't have to, and you should focus on the things that I have listed rather than creating investment nannies or similar instruments. You should focus on these kind of structural changes, and you don't need to reinvent the wheel, you shall look at the countries in our region that have been more successful, whether it's the Baltics or Central Europe.
Okay, thank you. And since you already mentioned this, it seems to be a very natural transition. So you mentioned privatization as one of the key mechanisms for ensuring constructive capital. Could you please make any recommendations regarding how to ensure that in the process of privatization, private constructive capital is created and not private corrosive capital?
Well, you have to make the privatization very transparent and open competitions where all bidders will have timely and equal access to information. You shall hire, reputable advisors to promote these opportunities and increase the number of participants, which will maximize the price and the competition for these assets. Smaller assets you can sell through Prozoro. That's a very good instrument, Prozoro sale. We have participated quite a few times in auctions, and I have to say that in all cases prices have increased substantially, and there has been investment. So I think this is quite important. On the other hand, unfortunately, in the 90s and 2000s, a lot of privatizations in Ukraine have happened with one competitor or with very few competitors. They have been kind of manipulated from the start, giving the conditions have been drafted in a way where the competition was actually minimized. So you have to open it to as many competitors as possible and provide information. So it's also the issues that this criteria that you have mentioned in your presentation.
Okay, thank you so much for such a detailed answer. And Pablo, if you don't mind, we have at least one more question for you. So Volodymyr noticed after interviews that in Ukraine, the mechanisms of promoting constructive capital are kind of repressive, so it's not so much about facilitation of constructive capital, but, repressing corrosive capital and sometimes not even corrosive capital, just occasionally. So can you please share any thoughts regarding how to build such a mechanism in order to make sure that it's like functioning market mechanism and not a repressive mechanism, if it's possible?
I'm very sorry. I missed the beginning of your sentence. So you're asking me about some kind of mechanism. The mechanism of what?
A mechanism of promoting constructive capital in Ukraine. Like in general, very short, how to make it not so much repressive, like more pro-constructive rather than anti-corrosive.
Okay. Well, look, I will just, if you're asking me, I would basically repeat everything what Tomasz has said because what he has said, I completely agree with. The point is make Ukrainian economy much freer than it used to be, and frankly, than it is. Because before the war, Ukraine was ranked number 130 for economic freedom by actually both by the Heritage Foundation and by the Atlantic Council. I mean, this is ridiculous. And by the way, in 21, before the war, Ukraine went down, not up, 7 to 130. This is ridiculous, and this is one of the reasons why Ukraine is not developing as well as some of the countries that Tomasz has mentioned, and some of the leaders of the growth in Europe and in the world. That's number one. And number two, why Ukrainians are not saving and investing enough, because economic freedom actually opens up the opportunities for the entrepreneurship. And for the entrepreneurship, you need money. So you would save and then invest because you see the opportunities, to become richer through the economic freedom. If you don't see those opportunities, you either spend your money or you don't even, save and invest, and it becomes a problem. And by the way, I would like to also mention, Tomasz mentioned Czech Republic for a good reason, by the way. I made a little small research on savings and investment. Actually, the Czech Republic is the leader in the region on savings and investment, and it comes up to about 30%, 29 to 30%. Again, a Ukrainian savings and investment rate is about 13. One more point about Slovak Republic. You're asking me about the mechanism. Sorry, I'm repeating myself, but maybe I'm giving more details. I talked to our friend Ivan Miklos, who was the Deputy Prime Minister and the Minister of Finance. He was the one who pushed the retirement reform, the pension reform in Slovak Republic, basically making Slovaks pay or save into their individual accounts rather than into kind of the common pot the Ukrainians are forced to pay into. In order to pay the current pensions to the pensioners here in Ukraine. Obviously, you are less motivated to to save, to pay into common pot than to save and invest into your own individual account. And that individual account can be managed either by the public companies or private companies. Obviously, we need the competition on that market too. So that is the mechanism that would, in my opinion, and I'm still, sorry, I'm repeating myself, but we are talking so little about this, even in this discussion. I'm a little surprised. Why? I mean, you take almost any material, any op-ed, any column, any article, any book about investment. I mean, take Martin Wolf, the most on how to stimulate. Martin Wolf is a columnist in the Financial Times, the legendary one. And his latest column on how to stimulate economic growth in the UK. And he says, number one, investment. Number two, savings. Number three, innovation. Well, we do talk about investment, and we talk about deregulation and privatization, economic freedom, again, something that Tomasz covered so beautifully, but we do not talk enough about savings and innovation, and it's something that I would like to talk more. I would like us to talk more because I see that as a mechanism. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Volodymyr, we have one more question from the audience. So you mentioned that the difference between corrosive and constructive capital is morality. And can we say that there used to be some persistent culture of corrosive capital in Ukraine? And what kind of cultural change might be needed in order to change this? And do we observe any change like this right now?
That's a fantastic question, in my opinion, that I absolutely agree. Then this change we need, that's not the change which should be mentioned just in one law. That is change that is in society, that is a change which takes years. Now, we in current obstacles, we have things to be done many times faster than before. And if we talk about changing morality, I agree absolutely then that we have a good chance to do it right now when society is consolidated against our enemy and against against their corrosive values. So what is our assessment about that's previous question. What was the shift in morality which is occurring in Ukraine? So some businesses in Ukraine which were not definitely constructive. Since 2022 made decision to be more transparent, to pay more taxes. Even in that cases, then they could use some minimization options, but now they understand their taxes are going to protect their country, so they're more optimistic paying taxes, and they feel their social responsibility. I think that's a good mental shift, but that's not what is happening just in a minute or in a day. Some alpha users or beta users go through this way, but we have a lot of work to do to make other business to follow this way. So I hope that will be faster than we expected a few years ago, but we do not have a lot of time for such changes. So I hope we'll do it in the next few years.
Thank you so much. And we have one more question for panelists, but maybe Volodymyr would like to answer it. And the question is, to what extent does it make sense to push for privatization during the full-scale war? Because obviously risks are higher. And what are the chances that, you know, such privatization will lead to the growth of constructive capital?
About privatization, there is no...
Sorry, Thomas, would you like to answer it maybe? And Volodymyr, you will have a chance to conclude.
Yes, I think that there is no reason to stop privatization. I mean, I was just amused to read today that the new head of the State Property Fund has included Centrenergo in the plan for privatization next year. This company has been mentioned for the last 20 years as a privatization target for next year, and it's been never privatized. We have put together a consortium in 2015 and approached the government of Western investors, financial and strategic, including a French, one of the largest French operators of thermal power stations, offered roughly $200 million to privatize this company. The government rejected it as too low. They wanted to wait a little bit further to sell it at the higher price. What have we seen since then? In the last 8 years, this company has generated billions of hryvnias of losses for the budget, and you know, you would have been better off to sell it for 1 hryvnia 10 years ago, because the state has to constantly subsidize it. Over the last 2 years, Centrenergo hasn't been able to buy coal, so it's burning gas that it takes from Naftogaz and doesn't pay for it. And it's been abused by different, say, oligarchs or people close to the authorities under the both under the current as well as under previous president. So most of these assets that are owned by the state, there's kind of a handful, less than a handful of exceptions of companies that are generating dividends for the state, but overall it's generating only losses for the state, direct losses. The assets are badly managed. They don't pay market salaries. They're not developing. Nobody's investing in them because they're always temporarily managed by political appointees. So there's no long-term investor interest in investing in them. So, you know, privatization makes sense at any price. That's why in the 90s, some of the countries in Central Europe and Ukraine actually as well have chosen different types of voucher privatizations. Some have been designed better, some worse. Probably the one in Poland was one of the best designed. We just privatized about 500 companies, and kind of large stakes have been sold to asset management companies, rather than, for instance, the voucher privatization in the Czech Republic, which sold minority stakes. But those have been then later consolidated, and kind of efficient managers have come to these assets So there is no excuse to delay privatization, absolutely not. And now, since the beginning of the war, the banking sector has seen a huge inflow of liquidity. We have over 500 billion hryvnias that have in deposits that have flown in, plus billions of dollars. There are several reasons for that. It's the international support that we are getting. It's the inability. It's the limitation on the capital account that you are not able to service foreign debt and pay dividends or repay foreign debt. Plus the salaries to the military, etc. So that has created a lot of liquidity. And there is interest to convert that hryvnia that businesses have accumulated into hard assets. So there's and there have been quite a few examples of successful privatizations over the last year where asset prices have increased quite substantially. So I think the longer you hold on to some assets, the worse they become. And one comment on what Pavlo said about savings and the difference between Czech Republic and Ukraine. It's in the way the central banks have been operating in those countries. In the Czech Republic, we have had kind of a cleanup and recapitalization of the banking sector in the mid-90s, and since then, the central bank of the Czech Republic is one of the leaders in the world. Actually, the IMF uses them as an example for all countries they work in. And on the other hand, the Ukrainian central bank has done the reforms only after 2014. Since then, it works very well, has cleaned up the banking sector. As a result, in last year, we didn't have a financial crisis on top of an economic crisis because the banking sector has been cleaned up, has been capitalized, related party lending has been abolished, which was abused by most of the oligarch-owned banks before. So you have to have for the increase of savings, you have to have a safe banking sector, which we now have, and the savings are increasing, but not quite to the level where they are in Central Europe, because the history of this of the independent central bank is relatively short, and there have been, unfortunately, some political attacks on the central bank, for instance, in 2019 and 20, when the new president came into power. So the independence of the central bank is extremely important for the increase of savings. And then you have capital markets. Unfortunately, they're quite underdeveloped. You have only treasuries. You have no stocks. Why don't you have a stock market? Because of weak rule of law. That's again courts. First of all, it's courts. They don't provide kind of protection to minority investors.
Hey, thank you so much. But just to underline how complicated this issue is, one of our viewers thinks that privatizing large state-owned enterprises during war will probably contribute to corrosive capital problem. Yeah, so views are kind of divided. But of course, what you said is well justified. So we thank you for sharing this. And Volodymyr, so I think we are about to finish this meeting. So I'd like to thank all the panelists. Thank you for being able to come, and thank you for sharing your thoughts with us. I'd like to remind that all the materials will be sent by email to registered participants, and they're going to be available on the Center for Economic Strategy website. So Volodymyr, could you please conclude, just raise some really key issues, and I think that will be it.
Before that, I would like to just say a few words about privatization, because I absolutely agree with Tomasz on every point. And let me just add that from people's view, there is no good moment for privatization at all, because if state enterprise is doing well, they say that's not a subject of privatization, and if it's doing not so well, people say that just give let us have better financial results, and then we'll do privatization. And the second point, Ukraine is the second largest country in the world by the number of state-owned enterprises. The first is China, the second is Ukraine. So we have only forest enterprises which own exactly just forest. The number of these enterprises are more than in all EU countries, all state enterprises. So we definitely need privatization. And if we talk about will it be corrosive or constructive capital, I absolutely agree with Tomasz that money we get from privatization, it's not the main goal. We get not only money, we get better practices, we get well-known companies, we're getting new investigation, and that's much more valuable than the money, given that we are not privatizing the largest companies. So we're not talking about privatizing Naftogaz or Ukrzaliznytsia for the moment. The largest company, even from big privatization, is like Tomasz mentioned, Centrenergo. That's many times smaller company than Naftogaz or Ukrzaliznytsia. And about conclusions, I thank everyone for coming. I think we had discussed a lot of questions, but we asked more questions that we answered, and that's a good start of a further discussion. I would like to take part in further discussions about different things, about constructive and corrosive capital in several sectors, about some laws we have to adopt to help constructive capital, or about how to distinguish constructive or corrosive capital. For example, I have very good practices in management. I am very transparent, but I work in tobacco industry. Am I constructive or corrosive? That's a lot of questions, so we have to deal with, and I would like to our panelists and our guests to take part in these discussions, and I hope we'll get interesting results which will help Ukraine to increase the percentage of constructive capital.
Thank you, Volodymyr, for wrapping this up in such a nice manner. We hope that in the future we'll be able to do more research regarding constructive capital and corrosive capital, how to promote the former and not to promote the latter. Once again, I'd like to thank everyone for being able to participate. Especially, I'd like to thank our panelists. And I think that's it. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.